Oh, do come in. It seems we have another little puzzle on our hands, don't we?
Miss Marple and the Christmas Tree Farm murder. Welcome back to Velvet Clues, where we unravel mysteries as intricate as the finest tapestries. I'm your host Connor, and today we're venturing into the charming village of St. Mary Mead during the most wonderful time of the year. Though, as you'll soon discover, not all Yuletide tales end in joy and merriment. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're listening from today. Are you by a cozy fireplace, perhaps surrounded by the scent of pine and cinnamon? Drop a comment and let me know. Now, settle in with your favourite winter beverage as we follow the ever-observant Miss Jane Marple through a case that proves even the season of peace and goodwill can harbour the darkest of secrets. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Rival Tree Farms. December had arrived in St. Mary Mead with a crispness that promised a proper English winter. Miss Jane Marple stood at her cottage window, watching as delicate snowflakes drifted past, settling on the bare branches of her rose garden. The village had transformed itself for Christmas with remarkable efficiency. Wreaths adorned every door and strings of evergreen garland wound their way along the high street. But this year, there was an undercurrent of tension beneath the festive cheer, and its source was the subject of considerable gossip. For 3 generations, the Morrison family had supplied St. Mary Mead with its Christmas trees from Evergreen Farm. Thomas Morrison, a ruddy-faced man in his early 50s, had inherited the business from his father, who had received it from his father before him. The farm was modest but respectable, growing organic Scots pine and Norway spruce in fields that bordered the village common. Every December, families would make the pilgrimage to Morrison's farm, selecting their trees while sipping complimentary mulled cider and listening to carols played on an ancient gramophone. This tradition had continued uninterrupted until September, when Gerald Price arrived in St. Mary Mead with considerable fanfare and even more considerable capital. Price was a London businessman in his mid-40s, sleek and confident in a way that immediately set him apart from the village's more modest inhabitants. He purchased 30 acres of farmland on the opposite side of the village and announced his intention to establish a premium Christmas tree operation featuring imported Norwegian spruces of exceptional quality. The village had been divided in its response. Some residents, particularly those who prided themselves on their progressive outlook, welcomed the competition and the promise of superior trees. Others, loyal to tradition and to the Morrison family, viewed Price's enterprise as an unwelcome intrusion. Miss Marple, observing these developments with her characteristic quiet attention, had noted how the rivalry affected the village's social fabric. She had encountered Thomas Morrison just yesterday at the greengrocer's. His usually cheerful demeanour had been replaced by a tense anxiety that manifested in the tight set of his jaw and the worried crease between his brows. He had been speaking with the butcher about Price's operation, his voice carefully controlled but edged with bitterness. "Imported trees," Morrison had said, shaking his head. "Grown with chemicals and shortcuts, sold at prices I simply cannot match. He's undercutting me by nearly 40%. How am I supposed to compete with that? My grandfather would turn in his grave to see what's happening to honest farming." Miss Marple had offered a sympathetic smile but said nothing. She had learned long ago that people revealed far more when they believed themselves unobserved or speaking to sympathetic ears rather than being directly questioned. That same afternoon, she had encountered Gerald Price himself at the post office. He was a handsome man with dark hair greying attractively at the temples, dressed in expensive country wear that looked as though it had never seen actual country work. He had been loud and jovial, distributing promotional flyers for his farm's grand opening. "Best trees in England," he had announced to anyone within earshot. "Premium Norwegian spruces, perfectly shaped, no bare spots or crooked trunks like you get from those outdated organic operations. Modern farming techniques, that's the key. Can't let sentimentality stand in the way of progress." Miss Marple had accepted one of his flyers politely, noting how his eyes moved constantly, assessing reactions, calculating angles. There was something about him that reminded her of a particularly smooth confidence man she had once observed in her youth. Not necessarily dishonest, she had thought, but certainly someone for whom truth was a flexible concept to be shaped according to circumstance. The tension between the two farms had escalated over the following weeks. Miss Marple had heard reports of arguments at village council meetings about parking access and signage. There had been letters to the local newspaper debating the merits of traditional versus modern farming methods. The vicar, Mr. Clement, had been forced to mediate a dispute when both farms wanted to donate the church's Christmas tree, each insisting their specimen was superior. 2 days ago, on December 18th, Miss Marple had witnessed what would prove to be a significant encounter. She had been taking her afternoon walk along the path that ran between the two farms when she heard raised voices. Peering through a gap in the hedgerow, she had seen Thomas Morrison confronting Gerald Price near the boundary between their properties. "I know what you're doing," Morrison had said, his face flushed with anger. "I've had my trees tested, and I've had samples from your operation analysed as well. You're using pesticides that are banned in England, chemicals that are illegal for good reason. I'm going to report you to the authorities, and when I do, your little operation will be shut down. Before Christmas." Price had laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "Report away, old man. By the time any investigation concludes, I'll have made my profit and moved on. Besides, you have no proof. Your word against mine, and who do you think they'll believe? A failed farmer clinging to outdated methods, or a successful businessman bringing innovation to a backward village?" Morrison had stepped closer, his fists clenched. "You're destroying everything my family built. 3 generations of honest work, and you're ruining it with your shortcuts and your poison." "That's called capitalism, Morrison," Price had replied smoothly. "Adapt or die. Your grandfather's legacy isn't my problem." Miss Marple had continued her walk, troubled by what she had witnessed. She knew Thomas Morrison to be a fundamentally decent man, but she also knew that decent men, when pushed far enough, could be capable of desperate actions. That evening, she had mentioned the encounter to her nephew Raymond during their weekly telephone call, though she had couched it in general terms about village tensions. Now, on the morning of December the 20th, Miss Marple was preparing to make her own visit to Gerald Price's farm. She had decided to purchase a small tree for her sitting room, and curiosity compelled her to see Price's operation for herself. She was fastening her warmest coat when her telephone rang. It was Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, her voice trembling with shock. "Miss Marple, something terrible has happened. Gerald Price has been found dead at his farm. They're saying it was an accident, but the police have been called. Dr. Haydock is there now. I thought you should know." Miss Marple thanked her quietly and replaced the receiver. She stood for a moment, her hand still resting on the telephone, her mind already beginning to work through the implications. An accident, they were saying, but in Miss Marple's long experience, when a man embroiled in bitter conflict suddenly died in what appeared to be an accident, it was worth examining whether that appearance matched reality. She collected her handbag and walking stick and set out toward Price's farm. The snow had begun falling more heavily now, covering the world in a blanket of white that should have been beautiful but instead felt ominous. As she walked, she recalled Thomas Morrison's angry face, his clenched fists, his declaration about reporting Price to the authorities. She thought too of Price's mocking laughter, his casual dismissal of Morrison's family legacy. The Christmas season, she reflected, was supposed to be a time of peace and goodwill, but human nature did not change simply because the calendar turned to December. Greed, anger, and desperation operated year-round, and sometimes they operated most dangerously when hidden beneath a veneer of festive cheer. Chapter 2. Death Among the Evergreens. The scene at Gerald Price's Christmas tree farm was one of controlled chaos when Miss Marple arrived. 2 police. Tour. Cars were parked near the entrance, their presence already drawing curious onlookers despite the early hour and falling snow. Yellow police tape had been strung around a section of the farm, cordoning off an area deep among the rows of Norwegian spruces. Inspector Frank Craddock, a capable officer whom Miss Marple had assisted on previous occasions, stood near the farmhouse speaking with a uniformed constable. When he spotted Miss Marple approaching, his expression shifted from professional concentration to something that might have been resignation mixed with a touch of relief. "Miss Marple," he said, walking over to meet her. "I should have known you'd appear. News travels fast in St. Mary Mead." "Mrs. Clement telephoned," Miss Marple explained simply. "She mentioned an accident. I hope I'm not intruding, Inspector." Craddock sighed, glancing back toward the cordoned area. "At this point, I'm not certain whether to call it an accident or something else entirely. Would you care to take a look? I'd value your opinion, though I'm sure I'll regret admitting that later. They walked together through the rows of Christmas trees, their boots crunching on snow-covered ground. The farm was impressive, Miss Marple had to admit. The trees were indeed perfectly shaped, standing in neat rows with mathematical precision. Everything spoke of careful planning and significant investment. Too perfect, perhaps. She found herself thinking of Thomas Morrison's more rustic operation, where trees grew with natural irregularity and the whole enterprise felt organic rather than manufactured. Price was found by his employee, Sarah Mills, when she arrived for work this morning at 7, Craddock explained as they walked. According to Miss Mills, he usually came out to cut trees himself in the early evening around dusk. He preferred to do the actual cutting personally, claimed it helped him understand the product better. Yesterday evening he was out here alone as usual. They reached the cordoned area. Gerald Price's body lay among the evergreens, already dusted with a light coating of snow that gave the scene a surreal, peaceful quality entirely at odds with the violent death it represented. He was sprawled face down, his body positioned at an awkward angle across one of the trees he had been cutting. The murder weapon, if it could be called that, was a large tree-cutting saw, its sharp blade embedded in Price's chest. Dr. Haydock, the village physician, was crouched beside the body making notes. He looked up as Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock approached. "Ah, Miss Marple, I wondered how long it would take you to arrive. Inspector Craddock's already heard my preliminary findings, but you might as well hear them too." "What are we looking at, Doctor?" Miss Marple asked quietly. "At first glance, it appears to be a tragic accident," Haydock explained, gesturing toward the scene. Price was cutting trees alone at dusk, as was his habit. He apparently tripped, fell, forward onto the saw blade he'd been using, and bled to death before anyone found him. The blade severed the subclavian artery. Death would have occurred within minutes. "At first glance," Miss Marple repeated, catching the emphasis, "but not upon closer examination." Haydock smiled grimly. "You've known me too long, Miss Marple. No, upon closer examination things don't quite add up. For one thing, the angle of the wound is wrong. If Price had tripped and fallen forward onto a saw blade lying on the ground or propped against a tree, the blade would have entered at a downward angle, but the wound track is nearly horizontal, as if the saw were held at chest height when it made contact." Inspector Craddock pulled out his notebook. "What else, Doctor?" "There's bruising on the back of Price's head behind his left ear. It's consistent with a blow from a blunt object, something heavy and hard. The bruising indicates it occurred shortly before death, possibly rendering him unconscious or at least severely dazed. There are also defensive wounds on his hands that suggest he saw the attack coming and tried to protect himself." Miss Marple stepped closer, examining the scene with eyes that missed very little despite her advancing years. She noted the position of the body, the way Price's arms were splayed, the angle of the saw blade. Something about the arrangement troubled her, though she couldn't immediately articulate what it was. "Inspector," she said slowly, "might I ask about the saw itself? Where was it found originally, and how was it positioned?" "According to Sarah Mills, Price kept his cutting tools in a shed about 20 yards from here," Craddock replied. "She says he would take what he needed for the evening's work and return everything before leaving. When she found the body this morning, the saw was as you see it now, beneath Price's body with the blade embedded in his chest." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. She walked around the body, careful not to disturb any evidence, examining the surrounding trees. Several had been freshly cut, their stumps still oozing sap. The snow around the body showed signs of disturbance, numerous footprints and drag marks, though the overnight snowfall had obscured much of the detail. "Dr. Haydock," she asked, "would you say Price's fall was what caused the fatal wound?" The doctor hesitated, then shook his head. "That's been troubling me as well. The wound is too clean, too precise. If he'd fallen onto the blade with the full force of his body weight, I'd expect more tearing, more traumatic damage to the surrounding tissue. This looks almost as if the blade was carefully positioned and then driven in with controlled force." "Meaning the fall happened after he was already dead," Inspector Craddock concluded grimly. "Or dying," Haydock confirmed. "I believe Price was struck from behind, knocked unconscious or nearly so, then positioned to fall on the saw blade. The actual fall may have occurred post-mortem, or very close to it. The bleeding would have continued briefly after death, creating the appearance of a fatal accident." Miss Marple walked to the edge of the cordoned area, examining the trees more closely. One caught her attention, a large Norwegian spruce about 6 feet from where Price's body lay. Several of its lower branches were broken, bent at unnatural angles. The bark showed fresh damage, as if something heavy had pressed against it. "Inspector, look at this tree," she said, pointing out the damage. "Someone was hiding here. These branches were broken by the weight of a person leaning against the trunk, waiting. And see here, on the bark, there are fabric fibres caught in the rough surface." Craddock examined the tree carefully, then called over one of the forensic officers to photograph and collect the fibres. "Good eye, Miss Marple. If someone was lying in wait, that suggests premeditation rather than a crime of passion." "It also suggests someone familiar with Price's routine," Miss Marple observed. "Someone who knew he would be out here alone at dusk, cutting trees in this specific area. That requires intimate knowledge of his habits and the farm's layout." "Which brings us to our list of suspects," Craddock said. He consulted his notebook. "Sarah Mills, the employee who found the body. She'd worked here since the farm opened in September. Robert Drake, Price's business partner who helped finance the operation and handles sales and marketing. Catherine Price, the victim's estranged wife who still did the farm's bookkeeping despite their separation. And Thomas Morrison from the rival tree farm, who was heard arguing with Price 2 days ago about illegal pesticides." Miss Marple said nothing, but her expression suggested she was already forming theories. She walked back to where Price's body lay, studying the scene once more. The snow continued to fall, gradually covering the evidence, covering the violence, making everything look peaceful and pure. But Miss Marple knew that surface appearances were often deceiving. Beneath the pristine white snow lay darker truths, and it would take careful observation and patient deduction to uncover them. "One more thing troubles me," she said finally. "The murder weapon itself. A tree-cutting saw is not something one typically carries when planning a murder. It's cumbersome, obvious, difficult to conceal. Either the killer came here intending to make the death look like an accident and brought the saw specifically for that purpose, or they used whatever was at hand in a moment of opportunity." "Suggesting either careful premeditation or a sudden violent impulse," Craddock mused. "The question is which." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, "and the answer to that question may well point us toward our killer." She looked around at the rows of Christmas trees, symbols of celebration and life now shadowed by death. "Inspector, I believe we need to speak with everyone who had regular access to this farm. Someone knew Gerald Price's routine intimately enough to plan this murder, and someone had a motive strong enough to kill during the season of peace and goodwill." Chapter 3. The Business Partner's Confession. The farmhouse that Gerald Price had occupied was a substantial structure, recently renovated with obvious expense. Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock entered through the main door, stepping into a warmth that contrasted sharply with the cold December morning outside. The interior was decorated for Christmas with a professional touch that somehow lacked genuine warmth. Everything was coordinated and expensive, but nothing felt personal or lived in. Robert Drake was waiting for them in the sitting room, pacing before a large stone fireplace. He was a thin, nervous man in his late 30s, wearing wire-rimmed spectacles that he kept adjusting with trembling fingers. His face was pale, and his eyes were red-rimmed. Whether from grief or stress was difficult to determine. "Mr. Drake," Inspector Craddock began, settling into a chair and gesturing for the man to sit as well. "I understand this must be a difficult time, but I need to ask you some questions about Gerald Price and your business relationship with him." Drake sank into a chair, running his hands through his thinning hair. "Of course, Inspector. Whatever I can do to help. I still can't believe Gerald is gone. It's like a nightmare I can't wake up from." Miss Marple, who had taken a seat slightly apart from the main conversation, took up her knitting. She had found over the years that people often forgot she was there when she appeared to be occupied with such a harmless domestic activity. They spoke more freely, revealed more than they intended. "How long had you known Mr. Price?" Craddock asked, his notebook open. "About 5 years," Drake replied. "We met through mutual business connections in London. Gerald had a talent for identifying opportunities, and I had access to capital through my family's investment firm. We'd partnered on several ventures before this Christmas tree farm." "And those previous ventures were successful?" Drake hesitated, just a fraction of a second too long. "Reasonably so. Gerald had an aggressive approach to business that didn't always play by traditional rules, but he got results." What do you mean by didn't always play by traditional rules? Craddock pressed. He was willing to take shortcuts that made me uncomfortable, Drake admitted. Nothing illegal exactly, but certainly ethically grey. He had a way of interpreting regulations rather creatively. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked steadily. She had noted Drake's careful phrasing, the way he was trying to distance himself from Price's methods while still acknowledging their partnership. It was the behaviour of a man preparing a defence. Tell me about the Christmas tree farm specifically, Craddock continued. How was it financed? Drake shifted uncomfortably. It's complicated. We applied for several agricultural development grants, both from the government and from private foundations that support rural businesses. Gerald handled most of that paperwork. He had a knack for presenting proposals that ticked all the right boxes. Meaning? Meaning he knew what reviewers wanted to hear and provided it. We claimed the farm would employ local residents, support sustainable agriculture, contribute to the rural economy, the usual language that gets grants approved. But those claims weren't accurate, Craddock asked sharply. Drake's face flushed. They were aspirational. We intended to hire locally eventually, and we did employ Sarah Mills from the village. As for sustainable agriculture, well, that was a matter of interpretation. Miss Marple spoke for the first time, her voice gentle but penetrating. Mr. Drake, were you aware that Mr. Price was using pesticides banned in England? Drake's head snapped up, genuine shock in his eyes. What? No, I had no idea. Gerald handled all the agricultural operations. I focused on sales and marketing. Are you certain about this? Thomas Morrison from the rival farm claims to have had samples tested, Craddock explained. He confronted Price about it 2 days ago and threatened to report him to the authorities. Drake had gone very pale. That would have destroyed us. If those allegations were proven true, we'd lose all our grants, face substantial fines, possibly criminal charges for fraud. The farm would be shut down, and I'd be held financially responsible for repaying the grant money. Did Mr. Price discuss any of this with you? Craddock asked. No, Drake said, his voice strained. But now that you mention it, Gerald had been acting strangely for the past week. Distracted, secretive. He made several trips to London that he didn't explain. I wondered if he was planning something. What sort of something? Drake stood abruptly, walking to the window and staring out at the snow-covered farm. When he spoke, his voice was bitter. Gerald had done this before on other projects. When things got complicated or risky, he had a pattern of extracting himself and leaving his partners holding the bag. He'd structure deals so that he could walk away with minimal liability while others bore the consequences of his methods. You think he was planning to abandon this venture? Miss Marple asked quietly. I discovered last week that he'd been moving money out of the farm's accounts, Drake admitted, turning back to face them. Small amounts at first, but accelerating recently. He'd also been in contact with lawyers about dissolving our partnership. I confronted him about it 3 days ago. What happened during that confrontation? Craddock's pen was poised over his notebook. He laughed at me, Drake said, anger creeping into his voice. Told me I was too soft for business, too concerned with ethics and consequences. He said he was planning to declare the farm bankrupt after the Christmas season, claim we'd overextended ourselves financially, and walk away. The bankruptcy would make it impossible for authorities to pursue the grant fraud effectively, and he'd already hidden enough money that he'd come out ahead. Leaving you to face any criminal charges, Miss Marple observed. Exactly. My name was on all the grant applications, all the official documents. Gerald had made sure of that. If fraud charges were filed, I'd be the one prosecuted, not him. He'd essentially set me up as his scapegoat from the beginning. Inspector Craddock leaned forward. Mr. Drake, where were you yesterday evening between 5 and 7? Drake's eyes widened. You think I killed him? Inspector, I'm not a violent man. Yes, I was angry with Gerald, furious even, but I wouldn't have murdered him. I was at home in my cottage on the far side of the village alone. I have no alibi, I'm afraid. Did you come to the farm at all yesterday? Not after noon. I left early because Gerald and I had argued again that morning about the money he'd moved. I couldn't bear to be around him, so I went home. Miss Marple set down her knitting, her eyes fixed on Drake with that peculiar intensity that had unnerved many a guilty conscience. Mr. Drake, You've been quite forthcoming about Mr. Price's fraudulent activities and his plans to betray you. Why did you remain in partnership with him if you were so concerned about his ethics?" Drake slumped back into his chair, looking suddenly exhausted. "Because I'm a coward, Miss Marple. I convinced myself that this time would be different, that the farm was a legitimate enterprise despite Gerald's shortcuts. I needed the money too, you see. My family's investment firm has been struggling, and I'd borrowed heavily against my inheritance to finance my share of this operation. If it failed, I'd lose everything. I was trapped." "Trapped enough to kill?" Craddock asked bluntly. "No," Drake insisted. "Inspector, I was relieved when I heard Gerald was dead. I won't pretend otherwise. His death solves many of my problems. But I didn't kill him, I swear it." After they left Drake, Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock stood outside the farmhouse, watching as forensic officers continued their work among the Christmas trees. The snow had intensified, reducing visibility and adding urgency to the investigation before evidence was completely obscured. "What do you think?" Craddock asked. He certainly had motive, and his lack of alibi is concerning. He also had everything to lose if the fraud was discovered, Miss Marple pointed out. But would killing Price solve that problem? The grants would still need to be repaid, the bankruptcy would still proceed, unless... She paused, a thoughtful expression crossing her face. Unless what? Unless there was something in Price's possession that directly implicated Drake in the fraud, something that would be destroyed or lost with Price's death. Documents, perhaps, or evidence of Drake's knowing participation in the illegal activities. That might constitute a motive. Craddock nodded slowly. "We'll need to search Price's office thoroughly. In the meantime, we have 3 more suspects to interview." He checked his watch. "Sarah Mills should be at the police station by now. Shall we?" Chapter 4. The Employee's Secret. Sarah Mills was younger than Miss Marple had expected, perhaps 25 at most. She sat in the police station's interview room with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, her eyes red from crying. She was a pretty girl with dark hair and delicate features, wearing practical farming clothes that somehow emphasized rather than concealed her attractiveness. When Inspector Craddock and Miss Marple entered, she looked up with a mixture of hope and fear. "Miss Mills," Craddock began, taking a seat across from her. "I know you've already given your statement to the constable, but I'd like to go over a few details again if you don't mind." "Of course," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever helps, I can't stop seeing him there, lying in the snow. It was horrible." "Start from the beginning," Craddock instructed gently. "What time did you arrive at the farm this morning?" "Just before 7. I'm usually there by 7 because Gerald liked to start work early. When I arrived, I noticed his car was still in the driveway, which was odd because he normally would have gone home by then. He never stayed overnight at the farm." "What did you do?" "I went to check the cutting area because that's where he would have been working yesterday evening. That's when I found him." Her voice broke, and she took a shaky sip of tea. There was so much blood, and the snow was covering everything, making it look almost peaceful except for the sore and the blood. Miss Marple, seated in the corner with her knitting, spoke softly. "My dear, this must be terribly upsetting for you. Had you worked for Mr. Price long?" "Since the farm opened in September," Sarah replied. "I answered an advertisement he'd placed looking for local help. I grew up on a farm, so I knew about agriculture and hard work. Gerald hired me immediately." "And what were your duties?" Craddock asked. "Everything, really. I helped with planting, maintenance, watering the trees, managing the irrigation system. I also handled customers when they came to select trees, processed payments, managed the scheduling for deliveries. Gerald said he needed someone reliable who could manage the operation when he wasn't there." "He trusted you considerably then," Miss Marple observed. A strange expression crossed Sarah's face, something between pride and pain. "Yes, he did. Or at least, I thought he did." Craddock noticed the shift in her tone. "Did something happen to change that?" Sarah was silent for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was heavy with emotion. "Gerald and I were involved. Romantically, I mean. It started about a month after I began working for him. He was charming, attentive, made me feel special. He said his marriage was over, that he and his wife were only staying legally connected for financial reasons, that once the farm was profitable, he'd divorce her properly and we'd be together." "I see," Craddock said carefully. "And was this relationship known to others?" "We tried to keep it quiet, but in a village like St. Mary Mead, secrets don't stay secret for long. Robert Drake suspected, I think. And Catherine, Gerald's wife, she knew. She called me 2 weeks ago and told me I was a fool if I believed Gerald's promises. What did she tell you specifically? Miss Marple asked, her needles clicking steadily. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. She said Gerald did this with every venture he started. He'd find a young woman, seduce her, use her to help with the business, then discard her when she became inconvenient or when the project ended. She said I was just the latest in a long line of women he'd exploited. How did you respond to that? I didn't believe her at first. I thought she was just a bitter ex-wife trying to sabotage his happiness. But then I started noticing things. Gerald becoming distant, making excuses not to spend time with me, taking phone calls in private. He was planning something, I could tell. Did you confront him? Craddock asked. Sarah nodded miserably. Yes, last week. I asked him directly if what Catherine had said was true, if he was planning to leave me. She stopped, struggling with the memory. He laughed. He actually laughed and said I'd been just entertainment while he got the farm established. He said I was useful for running errands and managing the day-to-day operations, but that I shouldn't have read anything more into our relationship. That must have been very painful, Miss Marple said gently. I felt like such a fool, Sarah whispered. I'd given up another job opportunity in London to work here because of him. I told my family we were serious about each other, and he dismissed me as if I'd been nothing more than a hired help who'd gotten above herself. Miss Mills, Craddock said, his tone becoming more formal. Where were you yesterday evening between 5 and 7? Sarah looked up sharply, realization dawning on her face. You think I killed him? Inspector, I didn't. I swear I didn't. Please answer the question. I was at home, in my cottage on Elm Street, alone. I'd taken the afternoon off because I couldn't face seeing Gerald. I stayed home, cried, tried to figure out what I was going to do with my life now that everything had fallen apart. No one can corroborate that? No. I live alone and I didn't see or speak to anyone. I know how that looks, but it's the truth. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Sarah, did you know that Mr. Price was using illegal pesticides on his trees? Sarah's eyes widened. What? No, that can't be right. Gerald was very particular about the chemicals we used. He had me keep detailed records of everything applied to the trees. Would you still have those records? Craddock asked quickly. Yes, of course. They're in the farm office. Gerald insisted on meticulous documentation of everything. After Sarah Mills had been escorted out, Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock remained in the interview room, considering what they'd learned. Another person with motive and no alibi, Craddock observed. Price seems to have specialised in making enemies. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed, though I find myself wondering about those records Miss Mills mentioned. If they documented legal pesticide use, but Price was actually using illegal chemicals, that suggests he was hiding his true activities even from his employee. Or Sarah Mills is lying about not knowing, Craddock suggested. Possibly, Miss Marple conceded, though her shock seemed genuine. Inspector, I think we should examine those records carefully. They may tell us more about Mr. Price's activities than any witness can. Craddock stood. Agreed. Next, we need to speak with Catherine Price. According to what we've learned, she knew about her husband's affairs and warned Sarah Mills. That suggests she was keeping close tabs on his activities despite their separation. Quite so, Miss Marple said, gathering her knitting. And I find myself curious about why an estranged wife would continue handling bookkeeping for her husband's business. That speaks to either lingering attachment or a determination to maintain access to his financial affairs. Either way, it bears investigation. Chapter 5. The Estranged Wife's Testimony. Catherine Price lived in a neat cottage on the outskirts of St. Mary Mead, about 2 miles from the Christmas tree farm. It was a modest dwelling, particularly when compared to the farmhouse her husband had occupied, and the contrast spoke volumes about the terms of their separation. When Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock arrived, Catherine was working in her small garden, cutting back dead plants in preparation for winter. She was a woman in her early 40s, with prematurely grey hair pulled back in a practical bun and a face that might have been beautiful once, but now showed the wear of stress and disappointment. She wore no makeup, and her clothes were serviceable rather than fashionable. When she saw them approaching, she set down her garden shears and removed her gloves with unhurried movements. Inspector Craddock, she said, her voice calm and composed. I've been expecting you. Please come inside. The weather is too cold for standing about in gardens. The cottage's interior was warm and tidy, furnished with pieces that looked as though they'd been collected over many years rather than purchased as a coordinated set. Catherine made tea with efficient movements, serving them in delicate china cups that seemed at odds with the cottage's rustic simplicity. "I assume you're here about Gerald's death," she said, settling into a chair across from them. "I heard the news this morning from the postman. He said it was an accident, but your presence suggests otherwise." "We're investigating all possibilities," Craddock replied diplomatically. "Can you tell us about your relationship with your husband, Mrs. Price?" Catherine smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "We were married for 18 years, Inspector. The first 10 were reasonably happy, or at least I thought they were. Gerald was ambitious, driven, always chasing the next opportunity. I supported his ventures, managed the domestic side of things, played the role of the dutiful wife. Then I discovered he'd been having affairs, plural, throughout our marriage. Not just casual indiscretions, but deliberate seductions of women he worked with on various projects." "How did you discover this?" Miss Marple asked gently. "One of his former business partners felt guilty and told me. He showed me evidence, photographs, hotel receipts, love letters. It was systematic, almost like a business strategy. Gerald would identify a vulnerable young woman in each new venture, seduce her, use her skills and connections, then discard her when the project ended or she became inconvenient." "Yet you remained legally married," Craddock observed, "for practical reasons only. Gerald wanted to delay the divorce until his various business ventures were settled. He claimed it was about tax implications and property divisions. I suspect he simply wanted to maintain control over our shared assets while preventing me from claiming what I was entitled to. Our separation agreement gave me this cottage and a small monthly allowance, but nothing more until the divorce was finalised." "But you continued doing bookkeeping for the Christmas tree farm," Miss Marple noted. Catherine's expression hardened. "Yes, at Gerald's insistence. He claimed he needed someone he could trust with the financial records, someone who understood his business methods. The truth was, he wanted to keep me involved so I'd be implicated if anything went wrong. I kept meticulous records of everything, Inspector. Every transaction, every grant application, every invoice. I knew what Gerald was doing wasn't entirely legitimate, and I wanted documentation to protect myself." "Did you know about the illegal pesticides?" Craddock asked. "Not specifically, but I suspected he was cutting corners somehow. The farm's production numbers didn't match the expenses for legally approved chemicals. When Thomas Morrison came to see me last week and told me about his concerns, I wasn't surprised." "Thomas Morrison came to you?" Miss Marple's needles paused briefly. "Yes, 3 days ago. He wanted to know if I had any records that would prove Gerald was using banned substances. I told him I'd look into it. I found purchase orders for chemicals shipped from abroad, ones that wouldn't appear on English agricultural supply records. I made copies before Gerald could destroy them." "Where are those copies now?" "In my solicitor's possession. I plan to use them in divorce proceedings to prove Gerald's illegal activities and protect myself from being held responsible for his actions." Craddock leaned forward. "Mrs. Price, where were you yesterday evening?" "Here, alone, working on those very documents. I was preparing a detailed report for my solicitor. I had an appointment scheduled with him for today, actually, to discuss how to proceed with both the divorce and protecting myself from Gerald's fraudulent grant applications." "Can anyone verify that?" "No, I live alone and saw no one yesterday evening. I know that's unfortunate given the circumstances, but it's the truth." "You warned Sarah Mills about your husband's pattern of behaviour," Miss Marple said. Catherine nodded. "I did. I felt sorry for the girl. She was so young, so naive. I recognised the signs, saw how Gerald was manipulating her. I couldn't stop what was happening, but I could at least warn her so she'd be prepared when he inevitably discarded her." "Did you hate your husband, Mrs. Price?" Craddock asked bluntly. Catherine considered the question carefully. "Hate requires passion, Inspector. I felt nothing for Gerald except contempt and a desire to be free of him. His death solves many of my problems. I won't pretend to mourn him, but I didn't kill him. I was content to let the legal system handle our separation and let karma handle the rest." After leaving Catherine Price's cottage, Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock walked slowly back toward the village centre. The snow had stopped, leaving everything covered in pristine white that crunched satisfyingly beneath their feet. 3 suspects, 3 motives, 3 missing alibis, Craddock said. Drake stood to lose everything from Price's fraud and betrayal. Mills was used and humiliated. Catherine Price was trapped in a marriage with a man she despised. Any one of them could have done it. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed, though we mustn't forget Thomas Morrison. He had perhaps the strongest motive of all, his family legacy being destroyed by Price's unfair competition, and he openly threatened Price 2 days before the murder. Chapter 6. The Rival Farmer's Rage. Thomas Morrison's farm stood in stark contrast to Gerald Price's operation. Where Price's farm had been all modern efficiency and calculated aesthetics, Morrison's evergreen farm felt organic and lived in. The trees grew in slightly irregular rows, shaped by nature as much as by human intervention. A weathered barn served as the office and sales area, decorated with homemade wreaths and strings of coloured lights that had clearly been used for many Christmases past. Morrison himself was in the barn when Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock arrived, repairing a piece of equipment with methodical concentration. He looked up as they entered, and his face immediately clouded with wariness. "Inspector," he said, setting down his tools, "I suppose you're here about Gerald Price. I heard what happened this morning." "We'd like to ask you some questions, Mr. Morrison," Craddock said. "About your relationship with the deceased." Morrison wiped his hands on a rag, his jaw tight. "We didn't have a relationship, Inspector. We were rivals and not friendly ones. Price was destroying everything my family built over 3 generations, and he was doing it through illegal means." "The banned pesticides," Miss Marple said quietly. "Yes, I had samples from his farm tested at an agricultural laboratory in London. The results confirmed he was using chemicals banned in England for good reason. They're toxic to beneficial insects, contaminate groundwater, and pose health risks to humans, but they allow trees to grow faster and fuller than organic methods permit." "What did you do with this information?" Craddock asked. "I confronted Price 2 days ago, told him I was going to report him to the authorities. He laughed in my face, said I was a dinosaur clinging to outdated methods, that by the time any investigation concluded, he'd have made his profit and moved on." "How did that make you feel?" Morrison's face flushed with anger. "How do you think it made me feel? My grandfather cleared this land with his own hands and planted the first trees. My father expanded the operation, built its reputation for quality and honest dealing. I've spent my entire life maintaining that legacy. And Price was destroying it in a single season with his poison and his slick marketing." "You were heard threatening him," Craddock said. "I told him he'd regret what he was doing. Yes, I meant through legal channels, through authorities shutting him down and fining him. I didn't mean I'd kill him, if that's what you're suggesting." Miss Marple spoke, her tone conversational. "Mr. Morrison, your trees are all Scots pine, are they not? I noticed them as we walked through the farm." Morrison looked puzzled by the change in subject. "Yes, primarily Scots pine. Some Norway spruce as well, but Scots pine has been our specialty for 3 generations. Why do you ask?" "Simply curious," Miss Marple replied. "They're beautiful trees. I've always preferred them to imported varieties." "Where were you yesterday evening, Mr. Morrison?" Craddock asked. "Here, working on the farm. I was cutting trees for orders that need to be delivered before Christmas. I worked until about 8, then went home." "Can anyone verify that?" "My son James was here until about 6:30. After that, I was alone. My wife is visiting her sister in Bath, has been for the past week." "So no one can confirm your whereabouts during the critical time period?" Morrison's expression darkened further. "Inspector, I'm not going to pretend I'm sorry Gerald Price is dead. The man was a parasite and a criminal. But I didn't kill him. I was going to report him to the authorities this week. I had documentation, test results, everything needed to shut his operation down legally. Why would I risk murder when I was about to win through legitimate means? It was Good question, Miss Marple reflected, though she also knew that rage could override logic, that a man pushed far enough might act without considering consequences. After they left Morrison's farm, Craddock sighed heavily. 4 suspects, 4 motives, 4 inadequate alibis. We're not narrowing the field, Miss Marple, we're expanding it. Patience, Inspector, Miss Marple counselled. The truth has a way of revealing itself if one observes carefully enough. There's something we're missing, some detail that will make everything clear. Chapter 7. The Hidden Evidence. Inspector Craddock had arranged for a thorough search of Gerald Price's office at the farm, and Miss Marple had been invited to observe. The office was located in a converted outbuilding, modernised with efficient heating and expensive furnishings that contrasted sharply with its rustic exterior. The search revealed exactly what Sarah Mills had described: meticulous records of pesticide applications, all showing legally approved chemicals in appropriate quantities. Yet these records clearly contradicted the laboratory analysis Thomas Morrison had commissioned. Someone was lying, or there were two sets of records. "Look at this," Craddock said, examining a filing cabinet. Behind the drawer fronts was a false back, creating a hidden compartment. Inside were additional files, these showing the truth. Purchase orders for banned chemicals shipped from suppliers in Eastern Europe, smuggled in through a network of shell companies Price had established. He kept evidence of his own crimes, Miss Marple observed. How curious. Insurance, perhaps, Craddock suggested. If anyone tried to implicate him, he could prove others were involved as well. They found more, correspondence with Robert Drake showing Drake's growing awareness of and objection to Price's methods. Letters from Catherine Price's solicitor demanding a fair divorce settlement. Emails from Sarah Mills, increasingly desperate in tone, pleading with Price to reconsider ending their relationship. But the most damning discovery was a handwritten note dated 2 days before the murder. "Met with Morrison today. He's going to the authorities. Need to move timeline up. Bankruptcy filing ready. Drake will take the fall. Catherine's evidence won't matter once I'm gone. S is becoming a liability." He was planning to disappear, Craddock said grimly. Abandon everything and everyone, leaving his partner to face criminal charges. And leaving Sarah Mills as a potential witness to his activities, Miss Marple added. He referred to her as a liability. They continued searching, and in a locked drawer they found something else. A wooden mallet, recently cleaned but still showing traces of what appeared to be blood in the grain of the wood. The handle bore a distinctive marking, burned into the wood. A tree insignia with the initials EF beneath it. "Evergreen Farm," Craddock breathed. "Morrison's operation. Or someone wants us to think it came from Morrison's farm," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. She examined the mallet more closely, then looked at Craddock. "Inspector, might I suggest we examine this more carefully? There's something about it that troubles me." Dr. Haydock arrived within the hour to examine the mallet. His findings were conclusive. The blood was human and matched Gerald Price's type. The mallet was consistent with the wound on Price's head. Fibres caught in the wood grain matched those found on the tree where someone had hidden. "This is our murder weapon," Haydock confirmed. "No question about it." "Found hidden in Price's own office," Craddock mused. "Why would Morrison kill Price, then hide the murder weapon in the victim's own desk?" "He wouldn't," Miss Marple said quietly. "Which suggests either Morrison is remarkably foolish, or someone else placed it there to implicate him." "The initials could have been added after the fact," Haydock observed. "That marking looks relatively fresh compared to the rest of the tool's weathering." Miss Marple was studying something else now, a sticky residue on the mallet's handle. She sniffed it delicately, then smiled in that particular way she had when a theory was forming. "Inspector, I believe I need to visit Thomas Morrison's farm again. There's something I need to verify." An hour later they stood in Morrison's equipment shed, examining his tools. Every implement bore the same burned marking, the tree insignia with EF beneath it. "I mark all my tools," Morrison explained. "Have done for years. Helps prevent them walking off or getting mixed up with equipment from other farms." "Do you have any mallets?" Miss Marple asked. Morrison showed them 3, all accounted for, all marked, all showing normal wear patterns consistent with years of use. "The mallet found in Price's office was meant to look like yours," Miss Marple explained, "but the marking is too fresh, too deliberate. Someone created it specifically to implicate you, Mr. Morrison." "But who?" Morrison asked. "Someone who had access to Price's office," Craddock said. "Someone who could hide the weapon there. That narrows our suspects considerably." Chapter 8. The Tree Sap Revelation. Back at the police station, Dr. Haydock had completed additional analysis of the murder weapon. He summoned Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock with an urgency that suggested significant findings. "The sticky residue Miss Marple noticed," Haydock began without preamble. "I've identified it as tree sap. Fresh sap, less than 24 hours old when I collected the sample." "From a Christmas tree?" Craddock asked. "Yes, but here's what's interesting. I've compared it to sap samples from Price's Norwegian spruces. It doesn't match. The chemical composition is different. This sap came from a Scots pine." "Morrison's trees," Craddock said. "Not necessarily," Miss Marple interjected. There are Scots pines growing all over England. They're a common species. True, Haydock. Agreed. But this sap has trace elements that suggest specific soil conditions and fertilization methods. I took the liberty of comparing it to samples from Morrison's farm. He paused for effect. It's a match. The mallet was definitely in contact with trees from Morrison's farm, and recently. The sap transfer occurred within hours of the murder, possibly during the murder itself. So Morrison did do it, Craddock concluded. Despite the staged evidence, he's our killer. But Miss Marple was shaking her head slowly. Inspector, think about what we know. The mallet was found hidden in Price's office, marked to look like Morrison's property. The sap suggests contact with Morrison's trees. But would Morrison be so careless as to use a marked tool from his own farm, then hide it in a location that guarantees its discovery during any investigation? People panic after committing murder, Craddock argued. They make mistakes. Perhaps, Miss Marple conceded. But consider another possibility. What if someone else obtained access to Morrison's farm, deliberately contaminated the murder weapon with sap from his trees, then planted it in Price's office? The evidence would point inevitably to Morrison, while the real killer remained safely hidden. Who had access to Morrison's farm? Craddock asked. According to Morrison, his son James was there until 6:30 on the evening of the murder, but Morrison himself left around 8, and the farm was presumably empty after that. Anyone familiar with the property could have accessed it. Robert Drake, Craddock suggested. He'd been to Morrison's farm as part of competitive research. Sarah Mills grew up on a farm and would know how to move around rural properties. Even Catherine Price might have visited. Or, Miss Marple said softly, someone we haven't fully considered yet. She explained her reasoning. The murder required several elements: knowledge of Price's routine, access to his office to hide the weapon, familiarity with Morrison's farm to obtain the sap, and enough cunning to construct a frame that would divert suspicion. Only one person had all these advantages. Inspector, Miss Marple said, I believe we need to speak with James Morrison, Thomas Morrison's son. James Morrison was a young man of 23, working on his father's farm while studying agricultural science at a nearby university. He was tall and strong, with his father's build, but without the weathered appearance of someone who'd spent decades working outdoors. When they interviewed him, his nervousness was immediately apparent. I was at the farm until 6:30, he confirmed. Then I went to the pub in the village for dinner. Got there around 7, stayed until closing. Can anyone confirm that? Craddock asked. The bartender, several other customers. I wasn't trying to hide my presence. Did you know Gerald Price personally? Miss Marple asked. Only by reputation. I knew he was destroying my father's business, with his illegal methods. I knew Dad was furious about it. Furious enough to kill? Craddock pressed. Dad? No, never. He was angry, but he was handling it through proper channels. He had evidence, was going to the authorities. Murder wasn't necessary. Miss Marple studied the young man carefully. James, did anyone else visit your farm yesterday evening, after your father left? James hesitated fractionally. I don't think so. I left before Dad, so I wouldn't know what happened after 6:30. But Miss Marple had seen the hesitation, the flicker of uncertainty. You're protecting someone, she said gently. Who was it, James? Chapter 9. The final pieces fall. James Morrison's resolve crumbled under Miss Marple's steady gaze. It was Sarah, he admitted. Sarah Mills. She came to the farm around 7, just after I'd left. I saw her car on the road as I was driving to the village. I didn't think anything of it at the time. Why didn't you mention this before? Craddock demanded. Because I was afraid it would make her look guilty. Sarah and I, we've been friends since school. When she came back to St. Mary Mead and started working for Price, we reconnected. I knew she was involved with him, knew he was treating her badly. I didn't want to see her blamed for his death. What was Sarah doing at your farm? Miss Marple asked. I don't know. I assumed she was coming to talk to Dad about something, maybe about Price's business practices. Dad had mentioned that Sarah might be a useful witness if he went to the authorities about the illegal pesticides. They found Sarah Mills at her cottage, packing boxes. She looked up as they entered, and her face immediately showed resignation. You figured it out, she said quietly. I wondered how long it would take. Suppose you tell us what happened, Craddock said. Sarah sat down heavily. I went to Morrison's farm that evening. I'd been thinking about what Gerald had done to me, how he'd used me and then discarded me like garbage. I was angry, hurt, humiliated. I wanted to hurt him back somehow. "So, you took a mallet from Morrison's equipment shed," Miss Marple said. "Yes. I knew about the investigation Thomas was planning, knew Gerald would be shut down eventually. But I wanted to accelerate it, to make sure Gerald suffered consequences. I thought if I could get evidence from Morrison's farm that proved Gerald was aware of the threat Morrison posed, it might strengthen the case against him." "But that's not what happened," Craddock observed. Sarah's hands twisted together. "No, I took the mallet, but I didn't intend to use it as a weapon. I was going to place it at Price's farm, make it look like Morrison had been there, maybe even suggest Morrison had threatened Gerald physically. Childish revenge, making Gerald paranoid and afraid." "What changed?" "I went to Price's farm around 7:30. I knew Gerald would be cutting trees, knew his routine perfectly. I confronted him, told him obite, had evidence that would destroy him, that Morrison wasn't the only one who knew about his illegal activities. He laughed at me, just like he'd laughed before, called me pathetic, desperate, said no one would believe anything I said." Her voice broke. Something in me just snapped. I had the mallet in my hand. I'd been carrying it, meaning to plant it somewhere on his property. When he turned away, still laughing, I swung it. I hit him on the back of the head. He fell, stunned but not unconscious. He looked up at me, and there was actually fear in his eyes for the first time. "Then what happened?" Miss Marple asked gently. I panicked. I realized what I'd done, that I'd actually hurt him. I should have called for help, but instead I positioned him to fall on the saw blade. I made it look like an accident. Then I went back to Morrison's farm, rubbed the mallet against several trees to get sap on it, burned the initials into the handle to make it look like Morrison's property, and hid it in Gerald's office." "You were setting up Thomas Morrison to take the blame," Craddock said. "I was creating confusion," Sarah corrected. "Evidence that didn't quite make sense, that pointed in multiple directions. I thought if it looked staged, you'd investigate everyone. And in all the confusion, maybe what I'd done would be overlooked. I didn't count on Miss Marple." She looked at Miss Marple with something like respect. "You saw through it all, didn't you? The mallet was too obviously planted. The sap was too convenient. A real killer trying to frame Morrison wouldn't have been so heavy-handed." "Indeed," Miss Marple said. "The evidence was meant to be discovered, but not quite believed. A clever plan, though not clever enough. The sap was your mistake, Sarah. It showed the mallet had been at Morrison's farm recently, but the timing didn't match Morrison's opportunity. Only someone else could have transferred that sap to the murder weapon after the killing." Inspector Craddock formally arrested Sarah Mills. As she was being led away, she stopped and looked back at Miss Marple. "He deserved what he got," she said quietly. "He destroyed people's lives without remorse. I'm not sorry he's dead. I'm only sorry I couldn't be smarter about it." After she'd gone, Craddock sighed. A young life ruined because of Price's cruelty. "2 lives ruined," Miss Marple corrected. "Price destroyed himself through his own actions long before Sarah Mills struck that fatal blow. Evil has consequences, Inspector, though they don't always arrive in the form we expect." Chapter 10. Christmas Revelations. Christmas Eve arrived in St. Mary Mead with fresh snow and a sense of quiet reflection. Miss Marple sat in her cottage, watching the flames dance in her fireplace, thinking about the case that had shaken the village. Thomas Morrison had visited that afternoon, bringing a Christmas tree as thanks for clearing his name. "I nearly lost everything," he'd said. "My reputation, my freedom, my family's legacy. If you hadn't seen through that planted evidence, I'd be facing murder charges right now." "Justice required the truth," Miss Marple had replied simply. "Nothing more, nothing less." Robert Drake had also stopped by briefly. He was leaving St. Mary Mead, returning to London to face whatever consequences awaited him regarding the fraudulent grants. "I was a coward," he'd admitted. "I knew what Price was doing and said nothing because it benefited me. I'll spend the rest of my life making amends for that." Catherine Price had called to inform Miss Marple that the Christmas tree farm would be sold, its assets liquidated to repay the fraudulent grants. She would receive nothing from Gerald's estate, but she was finally free. "That's worth more than any amount of money," she'd said, and Miss Marple had heard genuine relief in her voice. As evening fell, Inspector Craddock arrived with a bottle of sherry and updates on the case. Sarah Mills had been charged with manslaughter rather than murder, her defense attorney arguing that she'd acted in the heat of passion after prolonged emotional abuse. "She'll serve time," Craddock said, "but not as much as she might have. The jury will likely be sympathetic given Price's treatment of her." "It doesn't excuse what she did," Miss Marple observed, "but it does explain it. Gerald Price created his own destruction through his pattern of using and discarding people. Eventually, one of them fought back." "The irony," Craddock mused, "is that Christmas trees became instruments of death, symbols of life and celebration turned into tools of murder." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Thomas Morrison said something similar when he brought my tree this afternoon. He said his family's legacy, 3 generations of bringing joy to the village at Christmas, would now forever be associated with violence and death. That's perhaps the greatest tragedy of all. Gerald Price's evil didn't just destroy individual lives. It tainted a tradition that had brought happiness to an entire community." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, sipping sherry and watching the firelight. Outside, church bells began to ring, calling the faithful to Christmas Eve service. The snow continued to fall, covering everything in pristine white, nature's annual renewal. "Will the village recover?" Craddock asked. "Villages always do," Miss Marple replied. "People have short memories for tragedy and long memories for tradition. In a few years, this will be just another story, another example of how human nature can turn dark even in the brightest seasons. The Morrison family will continue growing their trees, and people will continue buying them, and gradually the shadow of this Christmas will fade." "But you'll remember," Craddock observed. "I always do," Miss Marple admitted. "Every case teaches something about human nature, about the capacity for both good and evil that exists in all of us. Sarah Mills wasn't born a burn killer. She was made into one through a combination of her own vulnerabilities and Gerald Price's calculated cruelty. That's worth remembering, worth learning from." As Craddock prepared to leave for the Christmas service, he paused at the door. "What will you do for Christmas, Miss Marple?" "What I always do, Inspector. I'll attend church, I'll have a quiet dinner, and I'll spend time with my knitting and my thoughts. Simple pleasures are often the most valuable, particularly after witnessing how the pursuit of wealth and status destroyed so many lives in this case." After he'd gone, Miss Marple sat alone with her reflections. The Christmas tree Thomas Morrison had brought stood in the corner, decorated simply with lights and homemade ornaments. It was a Scots pine, traditional and organic, grown with patience and care rather than chemicals and shortcuts. She thought about the various players in the tragedy that had unfolded. Gerald Price, who'd believed himself clever enough to exploit everyone around him without consequences. Robert Drake, who'd compromised his ethics for profit and nearly paid with his freedom. Catherine Price, trapped in a marriage that had become a prison. Thomas Morrison, who'd nearly lost everything while trying to protect his family's honest legacy. And Sarah Mills, a young woman whose life had been derailed by misplaced trust and wounded pride. "The pattern was there all along," she murmured to herself. "A man who used people as tools, who saw relationships as transactions, who believed rules didn't apply to him. Such men always create destruction eventually. The only question is how many people they damage before their reckoning arrives." The firelight flickered across her face as she took up her knitting. The rhythmic click of needles provided a soothing counterpoint to her thoughts. In the morning, the village would celebrate Christmas, families would gather, children would open presents, and life would continue. The shadow of murder would gradually recede, replaced by the ongoing flow of daily existence. But Miss Marple would remember. She would remember how greed and cruelty had transformed a season of joy into a season of violence, how the symbols of celebration had become instruments of death, and how the pursuit of profit at any cost had destroyed lives and tainted traditions. "Every stitch has consequences," she said softly, examining her knitting. "Pull one thread the wrong way, and the entire pattern unravels." Gerald Price pulled many threads in his lifetime, and in the end the pattern collapsed entirely, taking him and several others with it. Church bells rang across the village, their sound carrying clearly through the cold night air. Tomorrow was Christmas, a day of hope and renewal. But tonight, Miss Marple sat with her memories and her knitting, bearing witness to another dark truth about human nature revealed. The case of the Christmas tree farm murder was closed. Justice had been served according to that. the law, but the real justice, the understanding of how and why people destroy each other that could only be found in quiet reflection on winter nights like this. Outside, St. Mary Mead slept beneath its blanket of snow, peaceful and picturesque once more. And in her cottage, Miss Jane Marple continued her knitting, each stitch a meditation on the complexity of human nature, each row a reminder that beneath every surface, no matter how festive or innocent, darker truths often lay waiting to be discovered.